Hi everyone. So today we're going to go over Chapter 13, which is the Union in Peril. And this covers the time period from 1848 to 1861, just barely. It's just prior to Abraham Lincoln being inaugurated as President of the United States. So there are 64 slides. Let's see if we can get this done quickly. All right, so in the book, they talk about four different historical causes for the Civil War. One, obviously, is slavery. The fact that in the North, there's this growing abolitionist movement, and people are unwilling to negotiate or compromise on the issue of slavery because they felt it was a moral sin. Also, there are a lot of constitutional disputes over the role of the federal government and that of states' rights that had been going on. And we see that with the nullification crisis, first dealing with the Alien and Sedition Acts, and then the nullification crisis over the Tariff of Abomination. And there's also economic differences. The North is industrialized and the South is agrarian. And then there's what your book says is political blunders, extremism on both sides. But again, those people opposed to slavery ask, how can you negotiate the issue of slavery? Because it's just morally wrong. So, and the South believed that they wanted to just continue it. So for many, it's like, well, there was no way to negotiate, and war was inevitable. All right, so I created this though. These are events that led to the Civil War, certain things. And just prior to the Civil War, various events took place that just heightened the conflict between the North and the South. And of course, all of that was the land up there on the top of this timeline from the Mexican Cession. When all of that land came into the hands of the United States, the issue was, is slavery going to spread west or not? And next, the next thing is this growing abolitionist movement. So more and more people were opposed to slavery. There was also the Wilmot Proviso, and then that was up there. It's the next mark after that, and that was proposed during the Mexican-American War before the fighting even began, where David Wilmot suggested that none of the land be open to slavery if any land was gained by the Mexican-American War. And why this seems pretty minuscule to the South, it was huge that they're even suggesting that. So this infuriated the South, so tensions increased. Then California becomes a state because of the lawlessness there, and we're going to get the Compromise of 1850. So you see an image, a painting down below, the middle picture at the bottom. That's Henry Clay proposing the Compromise of 1850. Next, there is the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, which it showed slaves as human beings, as compassionate living individuals, and which many people, believe it or not, didn't see them as. So it put a face to slaves. And what this did is it really changed the hearts and the minds of many people in the North and in Europe as well. It sold millions of copies, about 3 million copies. The next one is Bleeding Kansas. There's going to be the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And basically, this is like a mini Civil War. It was the precursor to the Civil War. And then the gentleman up there to the left, well, our left of Abraham Lincoln, is Dred Scott, a slave that sued to said that he should be free because he was living in free territory of Illinois and Wisconsin. And the Supreme Court case said that he didn't even have the right to bring a case because our founders did not set up the country for Black people, basically. Also said that people could take their property, and slaves they deemed as property anywhere they wanted to because the Fifth Amendment and eminent domain. Then there is John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry, and that's that individual down at the bottom right. And then once Abraham Lincoln was elected president, that was all that the South needed to secede. So these are some of those events that are leading to the Civil War. And as you can see over to the left, A lot of it had to do with the lands from the Mexican cession, upsetting that balance of power of 15 slave and 15 free states. Okay, so what we get is a lot of debate, political debate about slavery. And as we talked about before, there was the Wilmot Proviso. So supporters of the Wilmot Proviso and others, maybe a lot of Northern Democrats who are opposed to slavery, they come together and they form this new party, which is the Free Soil Party. And this is a political cartoon of that on the right. The individuals who are burning the barn are Martin Van Buren and his son. And this is kind of a play on people were saying that if Democrats leave the Democratic Party, then they're going to ruin it, much as if a farmer were going to burn a barn to get rid of the rats, then you no longer have the barn, right? You got rid of the rats, but you don't have the barn. On the top right there, let's see, who is that supposed to be? I might have to look at my notes. Oh, it's Lewis Cass, who proposed, he's the one that proposed popular sovereignty. So they're basically saying that he's kind of been smoked out. He's ruining the party and that sort of thing. So the term barn burner refers to Democrats who are going to leave the party, who others say they're going to destroy it. On the opposite end, on the South, we have Democrats who are fire eaters, these people who are so staunchly supportive of slavery, and that's like their main topic, right? So anyway, these free soilers, even though it sounds good, like they're anti-slavery, they're not necessarily anti-slavery. They're more anti-expansion of slavery because they wanted Western lands open to white people and free labor, not slave labor, people who were free. Not that you didn't have to pay them, you had to pay them a wage, but a lot of these people felt that this would upset American values of upward mobility and having to work for hard work to get ahead. So their campaign was free soil, free labor, and free men. They had some tendencies of the Whig Party in the sense that they wanted internal improvements and they also wanted free land, so homesteads to people who settled out west, white people. Okay, so this guy right here, Lewis Cass, who I mentioned in the cartoon previously, he was a Democrat from Michigan who proposed this notion of popular sovereignty. He saw that it was a huge conflict, slavery was, between the North and the South. So he said, how about in these territories, we just let the people decide by popular vote whether they want slavery or not. And to moderates, they thought that that sounded perfectly legit. That's a great idea. He said the people will vote, not Congress. This is also referred to as squatter sovereignty. Okay, so that brings us to the election of 1848. Lewis Cass had positioned himself as a moderate for the Democrats, but then the Republicans run Zachary Taylor. Now, you may remember Zachary Taylor from the war, the Mexican-American War. He's old, rough and ready. He's the one that came down across the Rio Grande and the fighting broke out there, and then he came down from the north across the border into Mexico during the Mexican-American War. Then we have Martin Van Buren, who is not an abolitionist, but a free soiler, who is running as the candidate for the Free Soil Party. Taylor narrowly defeats Cass. A lot of these free soil parties were the people who were Democrats were taken away from the Democratic Party and they voted free soilers. So the Democratic Party split, allowing Zachary Taylor to become president, who was a Whig. All right, so then the issue comes up about the statehood for California. And I have a map of Texas to the right, but I'll explain that in just a minute. All right, so the gold rush happened and people just flock into California. They flood in from everywhere, including China. A lot of people are coming there. So 100,000 people settle there very rapidly, right? So there's a lot of law, a lot of ruffians, gun battles, there's disorder, there's lawlessness. And so California wants to become a state. So they get together, they draft a constitution, and they present it to Congress to become a state. Now, the balance of power, it's 15 north and 15 south. So if California had become a state, this would have upset that balance of power. As you know, ever since the Constitution was ratified, they would allow slave state and free state at the same time to maintain that balance of power. So this was really going to upset it, right? So because of this, and because Taylor said, yeah, why don't we go ahead and admit both California and New Mexico, people in the South were very upset because if California was going to be admitted as a free state, no slavery, and these fire eaters wanted slavery. So Northerners are upset over some things. The South is upset over the loss of the balance of power. Northerners, though, are upset because of these fugitive slave laws. So some states in the North had written these laws that said that they do not have to aid in capturing runaway slaves, even though that was part of Article 4 of the Constitution. And so in the state of Pennsylvania, this guy, Edward Prigg, was arrested for kidnapping when he captured a runaway slave. Well, this case goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that federal law trumps state law, and Prigg was within his rights to do what he had done in capturing a runaway slave. So a lot of northern states are angry about that. There's also people who are upset, or some people, out in New Mexico over the border of Texas. Now, I believe it was Fremont who had gone into, it might have been Kearney, who went into New Mexico and kind of established a settlement there, and then said, hey, Texas is claiming some of our territory. So there was dispute between them there because they didn't want slavery to go into New Mexico, even though slavery was present in Texas. So there's dispute over the boundary between Texas and New Mexico. So with all this heightened animosity, the great compromiser Henry Clay comes up with a plan. Now remember, Henry Clay had already done the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the compromise about the tariff of abomination when he gradually reduced the tariff. So this is his final compromise because he's going to die in 1852. Anyway, here's his plan. Let's admit California is a free state. Slavery will be decided by the two territories of New Mexico and Utah. Texas will give up that area in dispute between it and New Mexico in exchange for $10 million in claims against it by the Mexican government. Also, because so many people were upset that there was the slave trade in Washington, D.C., they said that slavery can continue there, but not the slave trade. So slaves can't be placed on an auction block and bought and sold. And the last thing, and probably the most controversial of all of this plan, at least for the North, was the fugitive slave law. For the South, it was the fact that California was going to be admitted as a free state. So each side is kind of giving up something. So this was proposed by Henry Clay, and you can see him there on the floor of the House. But what you may not notice is the guy glaring at him over here, that's John C. Calhoun, the leader of the fire eaters. So after Henry Clay proposes his compromise in the House, the debate moves to the Senate. And on March 4th of 1850, John C. Calhoun's speech was delivered. He didn't deliver it. It was given to James Murray Mason of Virginia, who gave this very long speech. And you know it's long because you were supposed to read it. It's in chapter 11 of documentary history. Anyway, in it, he rambles on and on and on about how there was going to be disunion. He argued that the equilibrium between the North and the South was upset because they had more people, they had more revenue, they controlled the government, everything was going to the North. And he said, and the North views slavery, that their view of slavery was contradictory to that of the South and their tradition. And so the South was threatened by this Northern superiority. And he said that there was nothing's going to happen except for disunion, and the only way it could be prevented, and he's basically giving them an ultimatum. The North has to work to prevent the breakup of the Union, and the only way they can do that is by providing more territory for the South to expand westward with slavery so that that would restore the balance of power to the South and the North. He was going to die just a few weeks later, right? He dies March 31st of 1850. After his death, there's this disquisition of government, and he talks about all the ideas in which the majority doesn't impose this despotism upon the minority. And one thing he proposed is that a dual presidency, a president for the North and a president for the South. I can't even imagine how that would have worked. So Clay delivered the compromise. And then John C. Calhoun gives the remarks to the Senate. And then it goes to the last of the three of the great triumvirate, the great debaters, Daniel Webster. And Daniel Webster is, in American history, kind of the best orator that there ever was. Very eloquent in his speech, right? He's probably best known for his speech in discussion of maintaining the Union during the crisis of the Tariff of Abomination. He said the Union must be preserved. And after reading Calhoun, you know that Calhoun kind of mocked that. You can't say good health, good health, good health, and have good health. Just like you can't say you have to maintain the Union, maintain the Union, maintain the Union, and it's going to be maintained. So anyway, Daniel Webster gets up and he delivers a speech which is known as the 7th of March speech. And he says, Mr. President, I come here not today, not as a Massachusetts man, nor as a Northern man, but as an American. So again, he's talking about the Union and how important it is to preserve it. He gives this speech, which is like 3.5 hours long, which is not too long for him. He was known for giving speeches longer than that. And he stated that slavery was not going to go away. However, it wasn't going to spread into Arizona and New Mexico and those places because it's a desert and it's really not conducive to plantation economy. So he says he urged the North to accept that. He said we need to accept the fugitive slave law. The only thing is it backfired on him. People in New England, his home state of Massachusetts, were furious with him for this. So what he decided to do was resign his Senate seat, and then he goes on to serve as the Secretary of State. He ends up dying in October of 1852, the same year as Henry Clay. All right, another speech was given by the next generation. So this is the third generation of American leaders. This guy is William Seward. He's going to go on to become Lincoln's Secretary of State, but he and Lincoln are political rivals for the nomination for president in 1860, and then Lincoln's going to end up appointing him as the Secretary of State. But he's known as a member of the New Guard, and he delivers a speech on March 11th, and in it he says there is a higher law than the Constitution. So he says any compromise is wrong and it's vicious, and he demanded the unconditional admission of California as a free state, and he warned the South that slavery was doomed and that secession from the Union would be futile. So he's just calling it like it is, and so he's making some political enemies, and this is why they're not going to put him on the ticket in 1860, and they're going to choose Abraham Lincoln instead. All right, so as a result of the Compromise of 1850, then California in the green comes in as a free state. And then that area of New Mexico and Utah was divided into two territories. And then those territories would be able to decide the issue of slavery based upon popular sovereignty. All right, so the way that it was passed, President Taylor most likely would have vetoed it, but he dies suddenly in July of 1850. A lot of people are dying in 1850. So Stephen Douglas, a senator from Illinois, who is just, they call him the little giant. But anyway, he was quite a shrewd politician. He worked his magic in Congress and got each aspect of the compromise passed separately. So he was able to do that. And Millard Fillmore, who had been Taylor's vice president, becomes the president, and he signs off on it, where Taylor probably would have vetoed it. He wouldn't have passed it. Still, though, people in the South who are strong supporters of slavery, these fire eaters, they're opposed to concessions. And so there's a movement to boycott these northern goods. But the balance of power, because the balance of power was tipped in the favor of the North, with California being admitted. But for a while, there's this brief calm. Southerners, though, are looking to expand. And as we discussed in the last chapter, they're looking to expand to Latin America, to Cuba, to elsewhere. Right, so you're going to get the Osted Manifesto and the Walker movement in Nicaragua. All right, so probably for the North, this was the most controversial aspect of the Compromise of 1850, and this is the Fugitive Slave Law. So there was a Fugitive Slave Law in the Constitution, but it wasn't being enforced in the North. So this was supposed to make sure that it was. So it said that a slave could not testify on his behalf or her behalf, also couldn't have a jury trial. And any black person, slave or free, could be sent south just upon the affidavit of the owner. So it didn't matter what the black person said, it's only what this white person said. So somebody could come in there and just claim that this person was their slave, and then they could take them away. Also, there were commissioners. The commissioners were given $10 for every slave that was returned, but only $5 if a slave was to remain free. So the incentive for these commissioners was to return as many people as possible to slavery to line their pockets. Also, if you're a white person and you helped a slave escape, you'd be fined $1,000 or you'd have to serve 6 months in prison. So this was ludicrous. I mean, for many people in the North, they just thought that this was unconscionable. This was beyond the pale. This was something that they couldn't align with at all, and they didn't. So many northern states just refused to enforce the fugitive slave laws. 8 northern states passed what's known as liberty laws to bypass or nullify this federal law. And what they do is they pass laws that prohibit officials from assisting in the return of any runaway slaves. Black communities, what they did is they organized vigilante groups or places where there was sanctuary for people to hide to protect them from being kidnapped. Also, a lot of black people just decided to flee. Many people went to Canada, they went to the Caribbean, or they went to Africa. 15,000 did. In some places where you would see slave catchers, mob action or riots would take place. This occurred in New York, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And this slave law was really unenforceable. Only about 330 slaves were actually returned from the North to the South at the time after this went into effect. Also, what we see is there's increased action by the Underground Railroad. More people are escaping, and they're going north to Canada or to other locations. There's also legislation introduced into the House to repeal the Fugitive Slave Law. So for the North, this is unacceptable, but the fact that it's not being enforced heightens the anger for the South. So everything is just continuing to exacerbate the tensions are. All right, so with the Underground Railroad, and you guys all know what this is, it's a loose sort of a network of paths, houses, safe places where people could hide as they escape from the south to the north, right? But they don't just go to the north. A lot of people go to Canada, or they go down to Florida, or they're just escaping into black communities within the south. They just want to get away from slavery and hide out. And when they did that, they usually went on foot. So the term Underground Railroad, it started to emerge around the 1840s. It hadn't started then. There were always efforts to help people, but the term railroad didn't come into play until railroads actually existed. But it had been around in the late 1700s. Even George Washington complained that one of his slaves were helped out this way. But anyway, usually escaped slaves were not helped they had to get into free territory on their own, usually by foot. So it's not like people were coming down into the South to get them. And typically, most people who escaped were those people on the border. If you're in the deep south, it was much more difficult. Maybe you could hide away on a steamship going up the Mississippi River or something like that, and that would give you quicker, safer passage than if you tried to go on foot. But then, boy, if you were caught on a steamship, watch out. So anyway, this started in the late 1700s, as I said, by Quakers. And Quakers were opposed to slavery. They're known as the Society of Friends. They're pacifists. So it was within their religious beliefs and within their nature to oppose slavery. Some of the best known conductors, though, and most people who were conductors, those people who assisted them along their journey, were Black people. So there's Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, but probably the most famous Quaker was Levi Coffin, who we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, so Harriet Tubman, you may know her story. She's born into slavery and she was in Maryland, so she was able to escape into Pennsylvania. She made several trips back to the plantation to help other family members escape. And then she was kind of distraught because she went back to get her husband, but he wouldn't go. And then later found out that he had married another woman. And she said that she kind of got a message from God to help other people do that. So she becomes a conductor and she helps to lead dozens of people into freedom. We don't know. I mean, some people over exaggerate, saying like 300. Others say, it's maybe about 60. She probably doesn't know. But she was very successful. She never got caught. She never lost a passenger. And for that, there was a bounty of $40,000 on her head. She was so knowledgeable about all the paths and the cities and the towns in the South that she was used kind of as a spy or an intelligence source during the Civil War. And then after the Civil War, she worked for suffrage and she also for women, and then also to end discrimination against Black people. Another conductor on the railroad was Sojourner Truth. She was born as Isabella Baumfree. She was born to slavery in New York in a Dutch family. They were mean to her, and so she escaped. And she eventually worked as a domestic with another family who was very kind and helped to buy her freedom. And then she discovered that Black and white people, there was good and bad in both groups. And she believed strongly in working together with white people to end slavery. So she is quite interesting. She's just a good, noble, humble person. She went to court to sue for custody of her child, who was going to be sent away down to like Alabama in slavery, and so she wouldn't see him. And she won this court case. She was a devout Christian, and she called Abraham Lincoln the Daniel in the lion's den because he was fighting to secure liberty and justice for all citizens. She ended up moving to Battle Creek, Michigan, and she helped dozens, if not hundreds of people escape slavery to Canada. And then this guy, Levi Coffin, is probably the most famous of all of the Quaker conductors. This is some images of his home in Indiana. He was actually a Quaker from North Carolina, and he hated slavery. And he first went out when he was a teenager, and he tried to find slaves to help to escape. Eventually they came to him, and then he kind of guided them on certain paths and gave them the supplies that they needed and that sort of thing. Then he ended up moving to Indiana, and from his home, it was a center where people knew word of mouth that you could go here to get safe passage. And even though his neighbors didn't also house these passengers, they helped. They provided supplies and everything else within the Quaker community. And it's believed that about 3,000 people passed through his home on their way to safety and freedom. Okay, so here's an image of painting of slaves escaping in the night. Okay, another thing that really helped to change the minds of people in the North and infuriate the people of the South was the book Uncle Tom's Cabin. How can a book, you wonder, change so much? Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote this, and what she did is she gave this very vivid description of the characteristics of people who were slaves. And a lot of northern people, they didn't really give it much thought initially, but what this did is it made Black people human. It showed that that the humanity of these enslaved people. And so they're reading this story. The plot is this Uncle Tom, this man named Uncle Tom, he is sold into slavery down the river, and he's a nice man who, for reasons of just trying to cope, he's kind, he's gentle, and he's submissive. He goes along with what he's told to do. No matter how kind he is, Simon Legree, this slave owner, is just ruthless and mean, and so it kind of tells a story about that and some other characters too in the book. Um, Harriet Beecher Stowe, never met slaves, and she got the characters, she based them upon books that she read by Black people, right? So she did that, and so she was criticized for it. Some people criticized her for kind of establishing these racial stereotypes for Black people, but it had a huge impact, both here in the North and in Europe. It sold over I think all total 3 million copies during this time, kind of that decade and the one that follows. And then she ended up going to the White House when Lincoln was in office, and he said, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war," or some people say this hell of a war. It also, some people did these unauthorized plays of the book called Tom shows. And these performances were going on for years, 90 years. And what it was is white people dressed in blackface, mocking Black people and kind of playing upon these characteristics, exaggerating characteristics about Black people. And this just kind of persisted, making it the longest running play in American history. It was even later made into a movie. All right, and then there was also this book by Hinton Helper, The Impending Crisis of the South. So this guy Helper, he hated slavery because he thought that it was ruining the South. He was from North Carolina. He said that this sort of thing was detrimental to the South's economy. His thesis of the book is slavery is inefficient, wasteful, it impoverishes the South, it degrades labor, it inhibits urbanization, and it thwarts industrialization, stifling progress. And it sounds like, well, yeah, you're spot on. The thing is, he's an ardent racist, and he believed that Black people should be freed, but then colonized somewhere else. I'm not exactly sure where he thought, maybe Africa. I think I put that down. I'm not sure. During the presidential election of 1860, the New York Tribune was distributing his book, like 500 copies a day. It was very popular in the North, but in the South, they were burning it. They hated this book. Right, so South, what they did to respond is they tried to support slavery, saying that it was a good, right? They said that slavery was a positive good for the slave and the master. They said that the Bible defended slavery and that it was part of Southern tradition, right? But they also said that slavery was better than wage slaves of northern industrialists, people who had to work all day just for a pittance of a living, and then when they go home they have to worry about their food, their clothing, their shelter, whereas if you're a slave you don't have to worry about those things. You're free of those burdens in the evening. So George Fitzhugh, he was probably the most ardent pro-slavery author, and he wrote a couple of books. One is Sociology of the South and also Cannibals All. And what he did is he questioned the principle of equal rights for what he said were unequal men, and he attacked the capitalist wage system. Here is a quote from him in Cannibals. All the Negro slaves of the South are the happiest and in some sense the freest people in the world. The children and the aged and infirmed work not at all and yet have all the comforts and necessities of life provided to them. They enjoy liberty because they are oppressed neither by care nor labor. The women do little hard work and are protected from the despotism of their husband by their masters. So this is his argument. Okay, so this brings us to the presidential election of 1852. And during that election, we do see the rise of the Free Soilers, so a third party contenders in there. So you have the Democrats, and they nominate Franklin Pierce. And they nominate him, even though he's a Northerner, he's pro-slavery, right? And the Democrats, as you know, is a group of people in a political party. They're all for states' rights. They're in opposition to internal improvements in the bank and that sort of thing, paid for by federal dollars. They're more the common folks, the workers in the factory, the small farmers, immigrants coming in, right? And they also have a strict interpretation of the Constitution, but mostly states' rights, right? And then the Whigs, those are very similar to the Federalists. They nominate General Winfield Scott. He's a hero of the war of the Mexican-American War. He's old fuss and feathers who comes and invades at Veracruz and then goes into Mexico City. And so this group of people, they formed originally in opposition to Jackson, but it's kind of the remnants of the Federalists, right? And they support Henry Clay's American system. Clay was like the unspoken spokesperson of the party, right? But then you also have Daniel Webster. Abraham Lincoln's going to be a Whig. William Henry Harrison was a Whig. And then the Free Soilers. That's kind of a coalition of a lot of people who don't want to see the expansion of slavery. We talked about that a little while ago. All right, so here are the three candidates, and Franklin Pierce is the one who wins because John Parker Hale pulled some of the votes away from the Whigs, so splitting the vote of the Whigs in 1852 and giving it to the Democrat Franklin Pierce. Right, so and you can see this right here. Pierce gets 51% of the popular vote, but he ends up with, what is that, 86% of the electoral vote. So, I mean, it was a huge victory. All right, so Pierce is not listed as one of the best presidents ever. He comes in and he kind of wants to support the radicals on both sides. So he's like, okay, so he brings people into his party who are radicals on both sides into his cabinet. So he's a pro-expansionist, though, wanting to appease the South. It was during his administration that we're going to get the Gadsden Purchase. There's also going to be the Ostend Manifesto, the secret agreement to get Cuba. He supported the Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Law, but he had this very traumatic experience shortly after being elected and right before, just weeks before taking office, where he and his wife were on a train. And trains were pretty dangerous at the time. And there was an accident, and their son was sitting there. And in this accident, their son was basically decapitated, and they witnessed the whole thing. So his wife was never quite right after that. And many people say that as a result of this, he was an alcoholic. So maybe he wasn't all there, or maybe, I don't know, mood swings, I don't know. Then we're going to get the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. So this was proposed by Stephen Douglas, again, the senator from Illinois, and what he wants is a transcontinental railroad with the terminus, the center, being from Chicago, and then it was going to go west to California. So it would have to go through the central part of the country, and it would benefit Stephen Douglas because he had land in there that would be developed and everything else. So he wants this to happen. So he's looking for a way to appease the South. Now, the Southerners, they want a transcontinental railroad also, but they want it to go through the South, and that is why we get the Gadsden Purchase that didn't suck, right? Douglas proposed a bill then that would divide the territory west of Missouri and east of the Rocky Mountains into two large territories that would be divided north of the 3630 line into the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. So what he said is that when people go in there, it'll be settled by popular sovereignty. However, what this would essentially do was nullify the Missouri Compromise. So there was a lot of debate about this, and it ended up passing both the House and the Senate, and Pierce approved it. So this is the Kansas-Nebraska Act, that territory north the 3630 line, where there was never supposed to be any slavery, was now going to be open to debate by popular sovereignty. So what happens is all these people start flooding into Kansas. Those people that had already established slavery in Missouri cross the border into Kansas with their slaves, and they establish homesteads. These people are known as border ruffians. Then you get a group of people coming from New England, and they are paid and they're aided by the New England Immigrant Aid Company to go there and establish an anti-slavery group in Kansas. So then there's conflict between the pro-slavery and the anti-slavery people there. The pro-slavery people set up a government in Lecompton, Kansas, and they write a constitution that allows slavery. The anti-slavery people, they establish a government in Topeka, Kansas. And then violence breaks out between both of them, and Pierce does nothing. Right? The Democratic Party, because of this, becomes even more divided between North and South. All right, so here's some of the violence that takes place in what they call Bleeding Kansas. They're pro-slavery people who go to Lawrence, Kansas, and they burn a lot of the buildings and homes in the town, and they end up killing like 2 of the people. In retaliation, John Brown, who we're going to talk about in a little bit, and his sons go to Pottawatomie Creek, where there's a pro-slavery settlement, and they ended up hacking up 5 pro-slavery people with broadswords and basically mutilating their bodies, right? So this violence is just unheard of, and people are just outraged by it, mostly in the North. Right, so this is John Brown right here. He was just incensed that he had to get rid of slavery. So he became an abolitionist. He's from New York. When Elijah Lovejoy, he had an abolitionist newspaper, and people stormed his offices, and they threw his printing press in the Mississippi River, and they ended up killing him. So a white person had been killed over the issue of slavery in Illinois, and John Brown was outraged by this. So he was moved to do something about it. He goes to New York, and he lives in a location where he helps farmers, where there's a free community of Black people there who he wanted to help. Then his sons, who had gone out to Kansas, they say, hey, Dad, you need to come here because we feel like we're going to be attacked from these pro-slavery people. So he goes there, and in retaliation for the attacks of Lawrence, he and his sons go to Pottawatomie Creek, right? And then over the next 2 years, his reputation builds, right? 2 of his sons, though, were captured, and a third of them was killed by pro-slavery advocates in Kansas. All right, and then another event occurred, and we've talked about this before, that also heightened tension between the North and the South. Anti-slavery Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts gave a speech on the floor of the Senate called The Crime Against Kansas. And in the speech, he attacks not only the Kansas-Nebraska Act, but also South Carolina Senator Andrew Butler for his support of it. He even mocks him. Butler had a speech impairment, and he makes fun of him there on the Senate floor. Well, Butler's nephew, Preston Brooks, who was a congressman, he's infuriated by this, and he goes to defend his uncle, who is not at the Capitol, by beating Charles Sumner almost to death with a cane right there on the floor of the Senate. Sumner's seated in his desk, and it ends up ripping from the floor because he's beaten so ruthlessly, and Sumner's trying so hard to get away. Brooks didn't challenge him to a duel because he said that this guy was beneath him. Sumner never really fully recovered. He did suffer from some brain damage. But as you're going to see in the movie Lincoln, he's around during this time, and he's a real strong anti-slavery advocate. All right, so anyway, the House votes to censor Brooks for his behavior because Northerners are so furious about it, but Southerners send him more canes. But this really, as I said, it heightens tension between the North and the South as if it wasn't already high enough. All right, so now we get new political parties, and this is going to be the Know Nothings, who we've talked about before, but now also the creation of the Republican Party. So slavery had really divided the North and the South over that issue. And it pretty much destroyed the Whig Party because people were going to go other places. So anyway, the Know Nothing Party was created in New York in 1849, years before. We'd already talked about this. Um, because this huge influx of immigrants into the country, about 3 million between 1845 and 1854. And so their main thing was to halt the spread of immigrants coming into the country. Then there's the Republican Party, and it was founded in Wisconsin in 1854. And this is a direct reaction to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. People were so unhappy about that. So this is a coalition of people who were Whigs, people who were Northern Democrats, barn burners, right? And then also free soilers. So they come together, and their main objective is not just to halt the spread of slavery, but to stop slavery. Right? And after the violence that took place in Kansas at Pottawatomie Creek and in Lawrence, their numbers start to swell. So they gain as a real political party at this time. All right, so in the presidential election of 1854, the Republicans nominate John C. Fremont. Now, Fremont was out in California, the Bear Flag campaign and everything, a member, you know, a member of the war, the Mexican-American War. And what they want to do, their platform says we're going to halt the spread of slavery. We want homesteads for people to settle out in the West. And also we want a protective tariff. So it sounds very familiar to the Whigs, very familiar kind of to the Federalists, but mostly the Whigs. And they make a really strong showing. They show that they could probably win a national election without even getting any southern states. And you look at it right here, you see that they did fairly well, but they didn't get Pennsylvania, Illinois, Indiana, New Jersey, but they could probably pick those up. The Know Nothings, they nominate former President Millard Fillmore. They keep this free soilers and know nothings that go with former presidents. But anyway, look at this. They got 21% of the votes. So you can tell how strong the sentiment was against immigrants. The Democrats nominate John Buchanan of Pennsylvania. He was kind of a moderate, and he didn't really take a stand one way or another with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, so he wasn't a controversial figure. So what happens, again, the Republican Know Nothing vote was split, and the Democrats vote James Buchanan in as president in 1856. So here's a famous quote by Abraham Lincoln. This is the reason why I love him, one of many. He always has great quotes, has a way with words. But when speaking about the Know Nothing Party, he says, how can anyone who abhors the oppression of Negroes be in favor of degrading classes of white people? As a nation, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. We now practically read it, all men are created equal except Negroes. When the Know Nothings get control, it will read, all men are created equal except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics. That's one way of saying it. All right. So then, going back to Kansas, the pro-slavery government writes this Lecompton Constitution legalizing slavery in Kansas, and Buchanan asked that Congress accept it and approve the pro-slavery Constitution of Lecompton. He knew, though, that the majority of people in Kansas didn't support it. I guess he was just trying to appease the South. But anyway, that would admit Kansas as a slave state. The Democrats and the Republicans, both in Congress, were opposed to the Lecompton Constitution, and Douglas even was opposed to it, and he sided with the Republicans, even though he was an advocate for popular sovereignty. He really thought that the people would end up just voting it out of existence, right? So he didn't think that this would happen because he didn't think that one through very much. So anyway, the people of Kansas in 1858, they were able to vote on the Lecompton Constitution, and they rejected it overwhelmingly. So this is yet another event that I told you at the beginning of this PowerPoint, that led to the Civil War, and it's the case involving this man, Dred Scott. So he was a slave in Missouri, and when his master died, the widow of his master took him to Wisconsin and Illinois, where he lived for about 4 years. When they went back to Missouri, he sued and he said he shouldn't have to be a slave because he lived for 4 years on free soil. I think your book said 5, but it's actually, I think it's 4. And eventually, the case worked its way to the Supreme Court. So at the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice was this man, Roger B. Taney, who was appointed, he was a Southern Democrat, he was appointed by Andrew Jackson. And they heard the case, and then they made this ruling. Basically, they said that Scott had no right to bring a suit because he was a black man, and the Constitution wasn't established for black people, only white people. Also, Congress didn't have the right to deprive people of their property because of Article 5 of the Constitution dealing with eminent domain and due process of law. Having said that, because you can't take away your property, the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional because it excluded your right to take your property wherever you wanted to take your property, including the Northwest Territories. So in a sense, what this did is it nullified the Missouri Compromise and it opened up the West for slavery, all of the West. Right? So here the ruling opened up all Western territory for slavery. Northerners denounced this as the greatest crime against the annals of the Republic. They believed that it was part of this whole big conspiracy to get Buchanan elected president and to expand slavery. So it encouraged a lot of Democrats to vote Republican instead of for the Democratic Party. And Northern Democrats like Stephen Douglas, they were placed in this very precarious, difficult position in which they had to support popular sovereignty without really denouncing the Dred Scott decision. All right, there's also a crisis that occurs in 1857. Your book doesn't talk about it, but it is important because it makes Buchanan look bad, right? It hurts his presidency, and people start to blame the Democrats for this sort of thing. So it might shift even more Democrats away from the Democratic Party, maybe towards the Republican Party in 1860. All right, so in Illinois, there's this upstart, tall, gangly, 6'4", good old boy, Abraham Lincoln, who's a great debater. He's not very well known, and he's going to run for Senate in the state of Illinois. He's running against a very well-known Stephen Douglas. They call him the Little Giant. He was a champion of popular sovereignty, and many people believe that he was the best chance the country had for preserving the Union, right? But he's challenged by Abraham Lincoln, who's really this unknown lawyer who was a state legislator in Illinois. So Abraham Lincoln, he's chosen by the Whigs to run as a senator for Illinois, in Illinois, right? But he knew he wasn't going to be elected because at this time, the senators were chosen by the state legislators, not by the people. And because I believe Abraham Lincoln was a long thinker, I think that he thought this is how he's going to make a name for himself, and then he can run for president of the United States. But anyway, historians debate. They go back and forth. Was he an abolitionist? Was he not? Maybe he was, but he didn't say so, because if he did, then he would never have been elected president during this time. So they go back and forth. Anyway, so he was a good speaker and a great debater. And he accepts the nomination, and he gives this very famous speech, the House Divided speech, which we're going to listen to. I'm going to read you an excerpt of it on the next slide. But anyway, so he does this, and he challenges Douglas to these debates. Douglas agrees. They meet at Bryant Cottage in Vement, Illinois, and this is where he agrees to it, and they come up with some sites where they're going to debate. Okay, so this is the House Divided speech, or an excerpt from it. It's very famous that Abraham Lincoln said. He said, A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the House to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south. Now, I think nobody believed that it was going to be pushed back up into the north. So Southerners had to hear this and think, he plans on getting rid of slavery. So you start looking at Abraham Lincoln this way, and if you're a Southern slave owner, you become fearful. All right, so these are the sites of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. I don't know, they went all around the state. So they went to Ottawa, then Freeport, then all the way down to the very south, Freeport up in the north, all the way down to the south at Jonesboro. And then the fourth debate was at Charleston, the fifth one up in Galesburg, sixth one in Quincy, and then in Alton, Illinois was number 7. Probably of all of these, and the main issue was slavery, Stephen Douglas tried to say that Lincoln was an abolitionist, and Lincoln had to say, no, I'm not. And he had to talk about the inequalities of Black people and white people, and we'll be looking at that in class. But anyway, up in Freeport, Lincoln challenged Douglas to reconcile popular sovereignty with Dred Scott decision. And basically what Douglas said is eventually through popular sovereignty, slavery is going to be outlawed. Now, this surprised a lot of Southern Democrats, and it made him look bad. So Douglas, he kind of lost some support from the South, but Lincoln became known nationally as a national figure. This is 1858. Lincoln and Douglas are going to run against one another again in 1860 for the presidency. Now, Douglas wins the Senate seat, as probably Lincoln knew that he would, because he was chosen by the state legislators who were Democrat. All right, so then the road to secession, if you look at this at the midterm in 1858, the Republicans is this brand new party. They just came around in 1856, sort of. They win all these seats in the House, right? So what they do is they start to, push for their agenda, right? Southerners are concerned that the Republicans and the Northern view on slavery and economic issues, which favored the North, they'd start getting higher tariffs. They'd get the presidential election. And then through John Brown's actions, all this is going to lead to their secession. All right, so John Brown's raid. John Brown, as you know, he was out at Potawatomi Massacre, avid abolitionist. He goes to a place at Harper's Ferry, which was in Virginia, right there on the border between Maryland and Virginia. It says here West Virginia, which hadn't been created yet. But anyway, he storms this arsenal, a place where they keep weapons, and he believes what he's going to do is disseminate these weapons to slaves in Virginia and start this huge slave rebellion. So he seizes a train. The first person he kills is an African-American watchman. He takes prisoners. After a 2-day siege, he is captured by Robert E. Lee, shouldn't be general, in the South. He's arrested, he's tried, and he's hanged. A lot of people call him God's angry man. Right, here's a vision of him that is a mural on a Capitol building in Kansas. And then if you look at it, here's a sketch that was done of him. It looks like a photograph. It's such a good sketch. But anyway, a sketch that's done of him at leaving his trial on his way to the gallows. You see a Black woman handing him a child who is Black. I don't believe that this ever happened. It may have, I don't know. But anyway, a lot of Northerners are really upset about this, and they condemn it. They say, he shouldn't have used violence, but the South isn't convinced. They think that this is all an attempt to get the slaves to rise up to aid in defeating the South. So he's seen as a martyr, so much so that the song Glory, Glory, Hallelujah, His Soul Goes Marching On, that song was written on behalf of John Brown, and Union soldiers would sing that on their way into battle. All right, and then we get the presidential election of 1860, which for the South is the last nail in the coffin. So the Democrats meet in Charleston, South Carolina, but then they have a falling out. So the North has their own convention in Baltimore, and they nominate Stephen Douglas, and their platform is popular sovereignty and the enforcement of the fugitive slave law. They believe that this will appease the South. Southern Democrats, they have a separate convention, and what they do is they choose John Breckinridge, who had been Buchanan's, or who was Buchanan's vice president. He's from Kentucky. Their platform said we're going to expand slavery and we're going to annex Cuba. I don't know if Cuba is saying that, or Spain. So that's what they want to do. And then the Republicans, they choose Abraham Lincoln over William Seward because William Seward, his views on slavery were well known, and he had some more political enemies than Lincoln. Plus, Lincoln was a very skilled debater who could probably help to carry a lot of Midwestern states. The Republican platform was to restrict slavery. Also, they want a protective tariff, they want homesteads, they want internal improvements. So kind of the platform of the Whig Party. So then there's a new party. It's called the Constitutional Union Party, and this was supposed to appease the North and the South. So it's a group of people, Whigs, Democrats, and know-nothings. And what they said was we're going to maintain the Union no matter what and enforce federal laws. All right, so here again, you've got the four candidates, Breckinridge, Lincoln, Douglas, and John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party. All right, and as we all know, Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860. You can see the blue states on here, the ones that he carried. He did not gain the majority of the popular vote. He did get 59%, though, of the electoral vote, which is more than what you need to become president. You only need 51%. And he only got close to 40% of the popular vote. Now, if you take the Democratic candidates together, Breckinridge and Douglas, they won more of the popular vote than Lincoln. So he's a minority president, and he's a very unpopular president, especially for Southerners. Anyway. So the platform, as I said, slavery wouldn't be allowed to spread any further, protective tariff, homestead, transcontinental railroad, and all of these were unpopular in the South. So what the South does, they feel that they have no alternative but to secede. So South Carolina is the first, of course. December of 1860, Lincoln was elected in November of 1860. And then in 6 weeks, we get 6 more states that follow, and then 4 others follow that. Altogether, there were 11 states that seceded from the Union. And here you can see a picture of them, those states below the yellow line. Now those above, Kentucky, Missouri, also Maryland, Delaware, but also West Virginia. West Virginia seceded from Virginia. They didn't want to separate, so they become a northern state. It was very essential that Kentucky stay in the Union because of the Ohio River. If the South had gained Kentucky, then the North would have had to fight for control of the Ohio, and Ohio was a huge vessel for transportation. All right, so the Confederates, they meet in February 1861. They establish a capital in Montgomery, Alabama. The Confederate States of America, they draft a constitution that's very similar to that of the United States Constitution, except it's a confederacy, and they place limitations on their central government, restricting slavery and a tariff. Their confederacy was created in such a manner that there was so much autonomy by the states that it's really going to hamper their efforts to fight cohesively and win at the Civil War, because they're not functioning together, they're functioning separately, much like the United States under the Articles of Confederation. So they elect Jefferson Davis from Mississippi as their president and Alexander Stephens as their vice president. Once Virginia secedes, then they move the capital from Montgomery, Alabama, up to Richmond, Virginia. So this guy on the left is Jefferson Davis. And the guy that looks like a 12-year-old punk, I'm sorry, but he does. That's Alexander Stevens. He's the vice president. Right, this is their Capitol, White House in Richmond, Virginia. This is their seal. They have George Washington on it. The Confederate States of America, 22 February 1862, and Dio Vindice is with God as our vindicator. All right, here's a political cartoon, Jefferson Davis going into war, kind of like this Prussian king, coming out as a donkey, or you can call it a jackass. Okay, and then during the lame duck period of Buchanan as president, a lot takes place. He doesn't do anything to stop the southern states from seceding because he didn't think that he had the constitutional right to do so. And then there's a man by the name of Henry Crittenden of Kentucky, same state as the great compromiser Henry Clay, who comes up with a plan. Hey, how about we extend that 3630 line of the Missouri Compromise all the way to the Pacific Ocean and make it a constitutional amendment allowing slavery south of that line. Lincoln announced that he would not support that, right? And also, the South seizes the federal port of Fort Sumter just off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina, and Buchanan does nothing. And really, there wasn't much he could do. We had a small Union army of just 15,000 men, and he was hoping for some diplomatic end to the conflict. And then here's some images of Fort Sumter.